Hello and welcome everyone. This is the second lecture on Hegel, and today we are going to discuss his views on family, civil society and state, and particularly his contribution in understanding civil society, and also his description of a state is regarded as the major contribution of Hegel in the history of political philosophy or in the history of Western political thought. No one before Hegel took so much interest in describing what is civil society, what are the modes of its functioning, and how it eventually lead to a different sphere of life that is called state. So, in this lecture today we are going to discuss his views on civil society and state. In the previous lecture that we have had on Hegel, we have discussed his intellectual or political context. That was the time of great art, literature, music and philosophy in German intellectual context, and there also kind of political development taking place certainly after the French Revolution, but also the demand for the unification of Germany. So, we have discussed this in the previous lecture and also discussed the personal life journey of Hegel and his views on freedom. So, in this lecture today we will begin with this argument of Hegel on freedom and how he see it as the idea which must embody something which is other than itself. So, the embodiment of other is central to the understanding of freedom according to Hegel, and in all the sphere of life, that is family, civil society and state, human being realize his freedom, his own self will while living with others through the associational life, and how he or she does that we will discuss this that in this lecture. In the next lecture that we will have on Hegel, we will particularly discuss his philosophy of right such as property and so on, and then we will critically look at the contribution of Hegel to the history of Western political thought. So, let us begin this lecture by looking at family, civil society and state as the realm where progressively human being realize his or her freedom. So, freedom, as we discussed in the previous lecture, remains a central attributes according to Hegel of the human being. So, freedom is something which is essential or the central characteristics or attributes of human being. Without the realization of freedom, there is no ethical life, there is no question of progress, there is no question of prosperity and happiness in the individual or social life. So, freedom is the central attributes of human beings. However, in contrast to the liberal or the Kantian abstract or formal notion of freedom, Hegel argued about its concrete or actual realization in the world through association with others, and that distinguishes Hegelian conception of freedom with say liberal and the Kantian views on freedom. So, for Kant it is necessary to think about yourself being free from the social and external constraints. So, the thinking is very necessary, which for Hegel was a kind of empty ideas, remain abstract. For Hegel the emphasis is more about on the will part, where individual not just think he or she is free, but act upon that thinking or that idea, and it is the acting upon that makes that idea real rather than abstract and hollow. And he is also against many liberal conception of freedom, which is about the choice or freedom from all kind of impediments. For Hegel, the freedom must be constitutive of both the subjective will of the people, that is his motive, his end or goals, and also his objective reflection that within a given society, within a given context, what is possible to achieve, that one can realize only through the rational assessment of his own goals and ideals, and thereby when you meet both the subjective and the objective condition, you can truly realize your freedom, and realization of it then requires its manifestation not just in the realm of ideas, thinking or abstractness. So, that is what distinguishes Hegelian conception. So, thus for him even an absolute idea, and this absolute idea is a kind of Kantian sense of noumena, or something in life which remains beyond the reach of human reason and rationality. How to go about it, how to think about it. So, he brings back the idea of God in his conception of morality and so on, or how to live a good ethical life. Similarly, in Hegel you have this idea of absolute will or universal will, which for many scholars is his reference to God, especially when he talks about state is march of God on earth, or it represents the universal and the absolute will of the individual. He is somewhat referring to something which is beyond the particular subjective will of the individual, which is something the larger, the universal spirit or the world spirit, which is called Geist, and the unfolding of that spirit starts with the family, civil society, and reach its ultimate stage in the life of a state. So, for him even this abstract idea, and many scholars consider it Hegelian or Hegel's reference to God, could not exist unless it manifests itself by embodying in something concrete or real in the world. So, even the absolute or universal will must express itself or manifest itself in the real concrete world to be realized, to get to know even itself. This idea of embodiment or manifestation in the concrete real world we can better understand by this description of Peter Singer's of Hegelian idea of embodiment. So, for Hegel sees God not as eternal or immutable, but as an essence or spirit, if you like, an essence that needs to manifest itself in the world, and having made itself manifest to perfect the world in order to perfect itself. So, this is a kind of dichotomy of self and other. So, for the individual to know his self, to become aware of his own self, the presence of other is absolutely necessary, and it is in contrast, in comparison to other, that human being constantly tries to or strive for perfection. Similar is the case with this idea of absolute will or universal will. Those will in the absence of concrete manifestation is immaterial, it is inconsequential. It becomes aware of itself when it really manifests itself in the real world. So, the realm of state is that realm where the universal or the absolute will manifest itself. Now, that will to become perfect, it must perfect the world. So, there is in Hegel, as we have discussed in the previous lecture, this transcendence of idealism and material divide. So, there is this a discourse in philosophy where a group of scholars would give primacy to idea as the primary thing, and the material is the manifestation of those ideas in a way. It is the secondary, whereas many other scholars would give primacy to the matter. Matter is the real, and it leads to the consciousness or formation of ideas depending upon your material existence and so on. In Hegel you have a kind of transcendence also of this divide between the ideal and the material, ideas and the matter and so on. So, even for the absolute will or the universal will to realize itself, to perfect itself, it must manifest itself in the real world, and that is the realm of state we will discuss later in this lecture today. So, for individual freedom, for the realization of self, for the realization of individual freedom, this embodiment in other is absolutely necessary in Hegelian philosophy. So, this we have discussed in the context of absolute universal will, which many scholars refer to God in Hegelian philosophy. Similar is the case with freedom according to Hegel, and for the human beings to realize their freedom, they must find its embodiments in something concrete and real, something that is other than their own self. So, the self and other is the necessary relationship for the self to become aware of itself, to become conscious of itself, and then to distinguish itself from the others, and also constantly, progressively perfect itself. So, the realization of freedom then requires its embodiment in others. So, you are aware of your own existence, or the freedom that you enjoy, or the use of rationality that you deploy while acting upon certain things or acting in your practical life. It all depends how you are perceived, how you are seen by others. So, the others are absolutely necessary for the realization of your own self, and that is the very crucial, unique description of freedom in Hegelian notions. So, unlike liberal conception of freedom, where individual is seen as atomistic, in isolation from others, and the freedom is that realm of life where you are free to do anything. You exercise your choice and options the way you like, without the constraint or interference from the other or the external forces. Here in Hegel, the realization of freedom must necessarily require the presence of other, and it is in the embodiment of other you realize your own freedom. So, thus others here in Hegelian philosophy of freedom are a prerequisite for the development of self and self consciousness of individual. So, human freedom is thus realized only through living with others, and this is the progressive movement from one stage to the other, and we will discuss in this lecture today how it develops from the sphere of family to civil society and finally to the state. So, the social institution and the practices according to Hegel are the realm of human freedom or location of human freedom. So, it is not then the abstract idea, it is something you can perceive, understand while looking at the social practices, social association or the life of community. It is in association with others that human beings actually realize the freedom, and this actual realization of freedom by exercising one's own free will is true genuine freedom according to Hegel, not in isolation from others, not in living a kind of atomistic life disconnected from others. So, the realization of freedom is more important, but that realization should be based on your own free will, but that must acknowledge the pre-existence of others, and this relationship with others is necessary for the realization of freedom. So, in that sense, the social or its institution and practices are the realm or the location of human freedom, not in absence of that. So, in other words, social or political institutions such as family, civil society and state are locations of human freedom, and the abstract ideal of freedom find its concrete manifestation in these institutions. So, as an individual you have freedom or free will is not sufficient in itself, unless you manifest it or you actualize it while living with others in the institution of the society and the political organization. Hegel discussed these relationship of individual freedom with the social and political institution in his famous text called Philosophy of Rights, and considered them as the expression or extension of the ethical life. His theorization of civil society and state is Hegel's best known contribution to the history of Western philosophy. And since Hegel, every time you think about civil society or why civil society matters, should it replace the state? This discussion started in 1980s and 90s with the revolution in East Europe, where the authoritarian regime was challenged by the civil society organization or voluntary organizations. So, since then it becomes a very kind of hurrah word. Everyone wants to have civil society and discuss about the absence of civil society and whether civil society is civil or uncivil. So, all these discourse can be traced back to this Hegelian conception of civil society. Prior to him, as we have discussed in different thinkers, there is not really a serious or systematic exploration of this realm called civil society. In the social contract tradition, particularly in Locke, you have these two stages of contract, but the very idea of contract for Hegel is the functioning or the relationship that exists in the civil society. So, you enter into a contract for certain benefits, for certain mutual benefits, and the very purpose of the contract is that fulfillment of your objectives or your purpose or goals. But the relationship between individual and state cannot be contractual, and we will discuss when we will discuss Hegel's views on state. Nonetheless, what we need to remind is that for the first time in Hegel we have a very thorough or systematic differentiation between the realm of life, which is civil society, and the realm of state, which is different from the civil society. And often it is confused that the realm of society and the functioning and behavior in the civil society is mistaken or confused with the realm of state or vice versa. So, Hegel's greatest contribution in political philosophy or in the history of Western political thought is perhaps his categorical differentiation between civil society and state, or his views on civil society and state. Now, as we have discussed in the previous lecture, that the self, to be aware of itself, requires the presence of others. Thus each person needs the other in order to be aware of himself or herself. So, it is like necessary for even having the self consciousness that you exist. In the absence of other, you may not be aware of your own self or the nature of your own self. So, to develop that consciousness, each individual requires the presence of other. What they expect from other then is this acknowledgement and recognition, and that is the fundamental expectation of human beings from each other, that you want to be recognized. Your existence must be acknowledged by others or recognized by others. It is the absence of acknowledgement or recognition that leads to conflict, that leads to problems in the society or in the social relationships. So, when you ignore someone, when you do not recognize the existence of someone, when you do not acknowledge the existence of the other, that leads to the conflict, that leads to social tensions. So, individual needs other, and what is the expectation of other is the mutual recognition and acknowledgement. It is the absence of that that leads to social conflict and social tension. But there is also the other side of this self and other relationship, that is, it is possible that individual self perception or what you think of yourself might be threatened by the very presence of others. So, you know, often in your life you may come across individual getting upset or getting threatened by the very presence of others. It is also possible. So, theoretically speaking, individuals should ideally recognize each other, acknowledge each other, but there are occasions in the practical life where individual may feel threatened by the presence of others. They do not want to do anything with the others, or they do not want to have any kind of relationship or association with others. Now, that would lead to conflict or control or domination of one over the other. So, the human history is also then the history of domination and subordination, control by one over the other or one over the many. So there is this relationship between the control, domination and subordination, and that do not really help in the realization of freedom or the human freedom, neither at the individual level nor at the societal level. So Hegel explains this condition of domination and control with his famous and strikingly original idea of master and slave relations and how it hampers individual freedom. So he argued that in this relationship, master enjoys the fruits of labor done by slaves, and slaves are totally dependent on the master for their survival. So this condition of servitude of one over the other, or this relationship between master and slave, are unequal relationship. It does not help in the realization of human freedom, neither for the master nor for the self. In fact, he gives the slave a scope for the realization of his own self, but master is deprived of that. Hegel argues that it may appear that in this relationship of master and slave, master enjoy all the fruits of labor done by the slaves, and slaves are dependent on the master for their survival. So for the master, then the slaves are merely things or objects which they can dispense with, or they can treat it like they treat the objects or mere thing, not a living subjective human being with a will. So in such a context, it may appear that master have everything. So master enjoys everything, one may get the impression when you have many people over whom you command. However, Hegel gives a very counterintuitive argument for this relationship. So he argues that the urge of the master, who seems to exercise all the benefit or all the labor done by the slaves, however his urge, which is the natural urge of the master for the recognition and acknowledgement by others who are equals, is not met. So the master, while exercise the fruits of labor done by the slaves, do not get the opportunity which is necessary for the realization of freedom, as we have discussed in Hegelian idea of freedom, that it is the embodiment of self in other. That is to say, it is by recognition or acknowledgement by other that you develop the consciousness about your own self. You acquire your own nature and then constantly tries to perfect it. In the absence of that mutual recognition and acknowledgement, you cannot be free. So in this dialectics of master and slave, where master seems to exercise all the fruits of labor done by slaves, he is deprived of this recognition and acknowledgement by others, because in slaves he cannot think of the slave as himself or equal to himself, because the slaves are merely things and objects to him. So masters could not see in slaves his own self image, and seeing your self image in other is necessary for the realization of freedom, and therefore the master is deprived of that. So whereas slaves could develop his self consciousness through his labor on external objects. So gradually slaves, through the fruits of his labor, develop his own self consciousness on working on the external objects. And this theory is further developed by Marx and others when he talks about human alienation, and we will discuss it when we will discuss Marx, that how society or market society deprive the individual from his natural association with others and from himself, and leads to the condition of alienation and so on. So Hegel gives the slaves this scope for self consciousness or developing the self consciousness through his labor on external object. However, the master is deprived of it. Thus Hegel argues that the control or domination of one over the other would be an obstacle for the realization of human freedom. So in other words, the master and slave relationship do not really maximize the scope for the realization of freedom, neither for the slaves nor for the masters. Even masters are much more deprived of freedom than the slaves. if you go by the reasoning of Hegelian conception of master and slave relationship. Now, we look at this idea of spirit or what he call Geist and its relationship with ethical life or the unfolding of a spirit to understand manifestation of universal or abstract will in the real concrete situations in life. So, the idea of a spirit or Geist, which is also referred to mind or universal mind, and will, that is human capacity to be aware of his or her own desire or goals or motives and yet apply his rational brain or rational faculty to understand what is doable. So, the combination of both that leads to action. So, the practical part or acting upon the will is more important. So, here in Hegel, therefore, the focus is not on reason and rationality, but on will that combine the both, the subjective element in the individual subject and also the objective conditions in which that will can really materialize. So, these two concepts, Geist or spirit, which is also known as universal mind, and will are central to Hegelian philosophy. He considered absolute will as the basis of all human actions, which is materialized through association with others. So, human being realize the presence of absolute will in himself. So, everything, as we have discussed in the previous lecture, is the manifestation of universal will. So, the universal spirit or the world spirit is something that is present in everything on this planet, both animate or inanimate. Human being can progressively realize it when they began to live the association life with others in different realms in their life, in the family, civil society and state. However, association with others should be directed towards the realization of ethical life, which he called Sittlichkeit, that means living an ethical life, and that connects to this idea of liberty or freedom, which also combines within it certain practical aspect or certain moral and ethical aspect within which human being can truly or genuinely realize his freedom. It is not like libertarian conception in the absence of all kind of restraints or all forms of morality or values or ethics. Those ethics, morality and values should be self-legislated, self-constituted. Nonetheless, the ethical or the moral sense requires for the true or genuine realization of freedom. In the absence of that, the freedom cannot be realized. So, the realization of the freedom requires a notion of ethical life, which he called Sittlichkeit, and it is the constant unfolding from different levels of individual life in family, civil society and state. So, it gives the individual a sense of belonging and also an obligation towards each other. So, this ethical life is something which is necessary for human to realize his sense of belonging, his own place in the world and also his obligation to that world, to that association to which he or she belongs. So, that ethical sense of life or ethical life, which he calls Sittlichkeit, is necessary or in fact guiding principle for the association of individual with others. So, they see in them expression of his own free will while performing his obligation towards the community or to the association life with others. This individual progressively realize this ethical substance while living the associational life with others in different realms of modern communities such as family, civil society and finally the state, which are according to Hegel reflection of three kind of will: subjective will in the realm of family, particular and reflective will in the realm of civil society and universal or absolute will in the realm of state. Now, we will discuss one by one all these three spheres of human life which make it possible for individual to gradually realize his freedom and thereby leading an ethical life, Sittlichkeit. So, first such association is the individual life in the family. And according to Hegel, family is the realm of subjective will. That means individual are well aware of his her own subjective will, subjective desire, passion, and he realized those wills in the realm of civil society. So, this is the realm of subjective will where two consenting individuals come together to live a life that is based on mutual trust, love, care and recognition. So, the foundation of family is this mutual trust among the partners or the consenting individual who are willing to come together to live an associational life in the close, neat, intimate bonds of family. So, the sentiments, the care, the selflessness determines the characteristic of family. It is constitutive of a husband, wife and children. Thus, Hegel description of modern nuclear family is based on the conventional and orthodox notion of family. So, if you compare it with say single mother family or other kind of imagination about living a conjugal relationship or living a intimate relationship with others in the family. In Hegelian, you have a much more conventional and orthodox understanding of family, where the presence of husband and wife are the necessary part of the institution called family. They come together to raise the children who would again, after living the life of care and protection in the family, will mature enough to join the life in the civil society and state and so on. So, this family for Hegel is the conventional and orthodox, and in the sense that it must have a male or a female. However, he acknowledged that such family is constituted and protected by the legal arrangements of modern constitutional state, because there is the realm of trust or property relationship that guides the human behavior in the family. And in Hegel, there is then a kind of interconnectedness also between different institutions such as family, civil society and state. And state is seen something which regulates all the institutions, including the family and the civil society. So, the family has then a kind of legal backup, a kind of legal arrangement that is provided by the institution of modern constitutional state. So, he regarded marriage, unlike many other scholars, not merely as a contract. So, for many scholars including Kant, marriage is something merely a kind of contract between two consenting adult individuals, but Hegel considered it something more than that, something much more bigger than merely two individuals coming together for under a contract for the mutual benefit. That is the realm of civil society. It is something a kind of very altruistic, and the Hegelian idea of a spirit continues to shape many of his discussion on family, family relationship, family ties, sentiments or realization of the subjective will. So, he did not regard marriage merely as a contract, but a union where when consenting partner agree to come together, they forego their own individual personality or subjective will and then see in each other their own self image. So, that is a kind of union rather than a kind of contract, which is the language of civil society. So, it was not merely as a contract, but a union of two consenting adults based on their mutual love and trust, and he regarded love as akin to freedom or reason, as it is also find itself in others. So, you cannot think of love without the presence of others, and it is in that sense similar to the idea of freedom. You cannot realize your freedom in the absence of other. So, is the feeling of love and trust, it requires the presence of other. So, thus for Hegel, family is first of all a union of two individuals having their subjective will. So, whether the two consenting individual come to form this family on their own voluntary decision, or they come in that arrangement through their parents. But when they enter as an individual themselves, they carry certain subjective will, their subjective desires or motives or goals. Now, this union then is based on the free consent and the mutual recognition. So, when both the partners, whether on their own or through their partner, coming together to live a life in the family, the act of living together requires the mutual recognition, requires the free consent of both the partners. Thus, in this union, the consenting adults give up their natural or individual personality, or if you like, subjective wills. However, in doing so, they do not lose themselves. It is not a kind of loss of subjective will, but they do so together. They constitute a single person and found their own selves or subjective wills in each other. So, that is the mutual trust and recognition that shapes the family relationship or behavior of individuals in the family. So, individuals in the realm of family are guided by altruistic behavior, that is to say, they are willing to sacrifice for the other members in the family, and the behavior of individual in the family is that of altruistic behavior, that is selfless care or protection or sharing of your own share with the other members in the family. So, the family in that sense is a very close knit relationship among the consenting individual, and the principle that guides family relationship is the altruistic behavior, not the personal selfish interest. However, human beings could not realize his true self within the confines of family according. So, this is the in a sense perfect setup for the individual, where your relationship with others is that of total trust or complete trust or recognition of each other, love and care for each other, and that is the best possible life one can think of. But it is very limited according to Hegel, that is, your altruistic behavior is limited to your only kith and kin, that is near and dear one. Beyond that, you do not extend that altruistic behavior, and the ideal for Hegel is to realize the absolute will of the individual. So, individual is the part of that absolute will, which he realized not within the limits of family, although in each other in the realm of family, individuals see the complete self image in the other, but yet it is a very limited or confined space for the realization of subjective will with the absolute will. That is possible among the strangers, where you are willing to sacrifice yourself for something which is larger, something which is universal, something which is absolute, and that is the realm of state for Hegel. So, it has limits where selfless behavior of individuals are limited to his kith and kin. Therefore, he or she must transcend it to foster association among the free and equal members in the realm of civil society. And now we move on to Hegel's conception of civil society. So, this is Hegel's biggest contribution to political science, and prior to him he argued that political thinkers often confused civil society with the state or the state with the civil society. The most glaring example of that is the social contract tradition. So, the contract is a language of civil society, and there cannot be the contract between the individual and the state. It is merely hypothetical construct. So, Hegel accused many other scholars or political theorists of confusing the civil society with state and state with the civil society, and he himself distinguishes it very clearly. So, he provides a detailed description of civil society and clearly distinguishes it from the state. So, civil society for Hegel exists in between the realms of state and the family. So, it is the realm of collective life that exists between the families and the state. So, all the institution, and we will discuss in detail what are those institutions, exist between the state and the family, and their individual is guided by their own particular self interest. The pursuit of self interest determines the associational life in the civil society. It operates on the market principles, and they are guided by the pursuit of their self interest. So, the realm of civil society is the realm of particular will, which is different from the subjective will. So, the particular will is your own personal interest, and your action acting upon that will is guided by the pursuit of that self interest, not the altruistic behavior in the family. So, in this sphere, individuals are driven by the pursuits of their pure selfish or particular interest, and this is very much in contrast to their altruistic behavior in the family, or when they are willing to sacrifice their life for the protection of a state in the realm of absolute will or universal will in state. So, the civil society is the realm of then instrumental means ends. So, you deploy the certain means for the achievement of certain ends, profit based relationship governed by the long term interest of the cooperating individual. So, you enter into a contract or in association with others in the instrumental manner, not because you are willing to sacrifice your share as you do in the family. In the civil society, you are willing to cooperate or form the association on the basis of the maximization of your profit. So, here in Hegel there is a kind of recognition of the classical economy or the market economy, and you remember when we discussed the social contract tradition, the criticism of the social contract tradition by C.B. Macpherson, that the kind of contract or the language of contract or the behavior of the individual they were talking about is the language of the market or the capitalist economy. What Hegel does is acknowledging that relationship. So, unlike romantics, he is not talking about going back to the pre-industrial time or living in the absolute condition of mutual recognition and trust that exist in the family, and then directly entering into the larger domain of state and the polity or the polis. He recognized the value of market relationship, and that relationship exists in the realm of civil society, and he also then transcended to establish the ultimate goal or the absolute will or the universal will of God in the realm of state, where the subjective will meets with the universal or the absolute will. So, in Hegel you have the acknowledgement of the market relationship or the particular interest. So, unlike other moralist or ethical thinkers, he do not do away with something that is undesirable, something that is purely selfish. It must be recognized, but at the same time it should be transcendent, guided by the ethical spirit or the movement of or the unfolding of universal spirit. So, this realm of civil society for Hegel then is instrumental, and it is also the realm of differences and antagonism, because different individual having different motives will necessarily create the condition of differences and antagonism, which requires the presence of a state to mediate and resolve them. So, like the institution of family, the regulation of which or the sanctity of which requires the presence of a state. So, family has the legal backup. So, the question of divorce and so on is regulated by the institution of modern constitutional state. Similar is the case with the civil society. There would be particular interest, and that may lead to conflict, that may lead to differences and antagonism, that requires the presence of a state to mediate and resolve them. And nonetheless, one should not confuse the two. The state represents the will of everyone. Civil society is the realm where individuals come together in the pursuit of their personal interest, and that may lead to conflict, that may lead to differences and antagonism, and that requires the presence of a state to regulate and mediate between the conflicting group. So, according to Hegel, it is the state which provides sustenance to civil society. So, it imagines the existence of a state. He also considered civil society as a modern institution. That means prior to capitalist industrial society, there is no discussion and debates around this idea of civil society. So, it creates the conditions for the realization of individual particular reflective self interest, and it operates on the market principles of demand and supply and the maximization of self interest or the profit. So, individual behavior in the realm of civil society is guided by their pure selfish interest, and they constantly try to maximize them. So, here in the realm of civil society, there is this recognition of individuals practical particular self interest which must be realized, which must be actualized in association with others. So, Hegel regarded system of needs, administration of justice, police and corporation as constitutive of civil society. So, civil society for Hegel then is not merely the realm of individual coming together in the pursuit of their personal interest. It must be mediated and regulated. So, the first thing is the system of needs. Individual will come together for the fulfillment of their needs, but then for the mutual fulfillment of needs without conflicts or antagonism requires the administration of justice, police or corporation that together constitute the civil society. So, the administration of justice, police and corporation are part of civil society and not just the consenting adult individual governed by their personal interest. Now, in this realm of civil society, individuals' relations with others are like market relations. They are largely free to dispose of their wealth as they wish, to buy and sell it as they deem fit, and also to employ or dismiss whomever they choose. So, there is a kind of capitalist economy in a sense where individual's wealth is his decision to decide the way he or she want to use them. So, the realm of civil society gives the individual absolute freedom to do with their wealth the way they wish to use them. They can buy and sell as they deem fit, and also they can employ anyone or fire anyone according to their requirements or their decision. Hegel also acknowledged the regulatory role of the state in the civil society that is necessary for the stability of economy. So, it is not like complete free market, because the complete free market would lead to the condition of instability of both the economy or the contract between the individual. So, for the stability of the economy and the security of government and also the happiness of each individual, he requires the presence of a state in the or state's official or administrator in the realms of civil society. Another interesting fact about Hegelian civil society is he did not distinguish the civil society into classes such as owners or non-owners of property as Marx did, or into states such as landlords, capitalists and laborers as we find in the classical economists and other philosophers or thinkers. So, for Hegel, civil society is not divided into then the owning classes or non-owning classes as in Marx, or three states. So, based on the hierarchy, the landlords, the capitalists and the laborers. Hegel makes a distinction between those who worked on the land and the professionals like doctors and lawyers. So, they constitute the civil society for Hegel along with the institutions of state such as police, administration of justice, and also when different individuals come together to form what he calls corporation. So he also envisioned the role of administrators and officials who worked for the common interest of the society. So they have a decisive role to play in the realm of civil society as well. So he considered the corporation the another important elements in the realm of civil society as professional guilds which integrates the individuals with the economic life of the society or community. So it is larger than the contract between the two individual or a group of individuals. It is the larger body where individual learn to live a kind of associational life for the pursuit of mutual interest and forming long term collegiality or fraternity among the free and equal citizen in the pursuit of their common interest or the collective interest. So it is the reflection of their long term particular interest which they could achieve through forming association and collegiality with others. So that is the something which is a kind of far more stable or associational form of life, something akin to family, but different in a sense that it is guided by the personal interest and also the state, where different individual will come together for the fulfillment of their collective interest, and that they do keeping in mind the long term interest of their member or their association. And yet it is somewhat sort of absolute or universal will in the state, as the guiding force for the corporation and association is the personal interest or the particular interest of their group or their association alone. So in this realm, though guided by their own conscious particular interest, but indirectly or unconsciously they also help in the fulfillment of others' interests. So the corporation in that sense is a kind of training ground for the individual where they pursue their interest, and in the pursuit of interest they also provide the condition for others to pursue their interests as well. So it is a kind of mutual recognition or fulfillment of mutual interest while you realize your own freedom, your own personal interest. Now we move on to the idea of state, where state for Hegel is a political community of free and equal members which subsumes within it all other forms of associations and institutions in the society. So state is that institution which regulates or mediates between all other institutions or association in the society or the community. It is the embodiment of concrete freedom and represents the universal or the absolute will. Thus he considered a state as a march of God on earth, and human reason or freedom could realize its ultimate development in the life of a state. So its ultimate form of associational life, very different from the life in the family and in the civil society. It is in the state while living among the equals that individuals transcend their particularistic behavior that existed in the realm of civil society. Here they see themselves as the part of larger collectivity. They also began to see themselves as the part of larger or collective self, in other words the absolute will, and they are willing to sacrifice for the protection of that will. So it is like similar to family, but the obligation is not limited to the kith and kin or near and dear ones in the family. You are willing to sacrifice for certain ideal, certain goals which is that of the state, and that you do for the strangers, even those whom you not meet. So the conception of a state is a stage of life where subjective will of the individual merge with the objective will of the state. So it is like in certain sense Rousseau's general will. So you see yourself as the part of the larger self, and this relationship is that of organic. You are willing to sacrifice yourself for the sake of that order, that state or institution. Thus, in the realm of state, individual's subjective or particular will merge with the universal or absolute will of the community, and it enables them to lead an ethical life or settled guide in true sense of the term. So, the purpose of individual life is to realize his or her true freedom, and his her true freedom requires the merger of both the subjective and the objective will. A state is the only institution of associational life which provides the individual to lead his subjective life, at the same time connecting it with the larger life of the community or the state. So, Hegel had a very interesting description of modern rational state. He wanted it to be a constitutional monarchy. So, here monarchs should be regulated by the constitution, or it should have limited power. The state should represent the will of the people. So, the subjective will of the people is necessary for the maintenance or the sustenance of the state. However, the will of the people should be respected, but people themselves, according to Hegel, are not capable of governing. So, he wanted the government or the task of government should be given to the experts, those who are knowledgeable in governing. So, he wanted the persons with superior knowledge and virtue should occupy the key positions of power. Thus, he envisions a universal class which you call bureaucracy, or in modern sense the bureaucrats. So, he envisions a universal class of bureaucracy for running the administration of the state. They are selected on the basis of open merit and thoroughly trained to govern their conduct as per the universal will or the common interest of the whole community. So, this class of bureaucracy, the universal class, is guided by the universal spirit. So, they embodies in certain sense the universal spirit or the absolute will, and protect the interest of everyone in the state. So, Hegel was also in favor of various checks and balances to prevent corruptions and abuse of power. Like Montesquieu, Hegel also wanted the institution of modern rational state to be divided into legislative, judicial and executive organ, and this remains the three fundamental core organs of the state. So, all kind of modern state you will find having these three primary organs, and the power is divided between these three organs, and they also tend to check each other's power. The legislature which legislate the law or formulate the policy, the executive which really exercise the power and authority or implement those legislation and policy, and judiciary to oversee that executive operates and functions within the limits of law, within the limits of legislation and the policies. So, Hegel also accepts such division of power in modern rational state like Montesquieu, and fearing the disastrous consequences of untutored opinion. In the public life of nation, you may find most of the atomistic individual giving all kind of opinions without thorough reflection or proper training about how a state should behave and how institutions should function. Hegel feared such untutored opinion of atomistic individual and its disastrous consequences. So, Hegel was against direct elections for the members of legislature. He wanted the legislature to be constitutive of the representative of civil society, and the corporations in civil society reflect the will or opinion of people in legislation and the policies of the state. So, what you have in Hegel is the reflection of people's will, their subjective will, and so long as the people feel that their will is respected by the state, they will support the state, they will maintain its stability. Only when people realize that their will is not respected or represented in the state, then they take up arms against the state or rebel against the state, and the French Revolution was the classic example of the case where the monarchy was seen by larger population not representing or reflecting their will. So, Hegel recognized the role of people's will, and he wanted the modern state to represent or respect those will, but he does not give the people right to elect, or institution of a state should be guided by the untutored opinion of the atomistic individual. It should be given to a class which he called universal class of bureaucracy, which embodies the universal will or absolute will and act in the interest of the whole community and not the particular interest of the groups or sections in the society. So, in that sense, Hegelian state is much more unique state that provides the ideal condition for the individual to realize his free will in both subjective and objective sense. So, the subjective will is organically connected with the objective will of the state. So, it enables the condition, or it enables the individual to live and realize what is called ethical life. So, the best possible development of human reason, freedom, living the life of ethics or ethical life is possible in the realm of state alone, where the state develops, nourishes and respects individual subjectivity while maintaining the stable social and political order to which each individual has unconditional duty and obligation. So, this interconnection between the subjective will of the individual, which must be fulfilled or actualized, at the same time individual obligation to the association, that is the state. So, the state, as we have discussed in say social contract tradition, requires the obligation of the citizens, and why citizens should obey the state. Social contract tradition gives a particular explanation for that, because the state is formed on the basis of the consent of the people, and that consent then in turn demands obligation from the citizen towards the state. However, in Hegel there is a kind of organic or kind of intimate relationship between the individual and the state, where while protecting the state, they protect their own conditions for freedom. They realize their own self in the realization of the life of the state, or in the protection of the absolute will or the universal will of the state. So, in the protection of a state, individuals see the protection of those conditions necessary for the realization of their own freedom. So, while protecting the state, then the individual protect those conditions which is necessary for the realization of their own subjective will or their own self or their own freedom. So, Hegelian conception of modern state is very different from the social contract tradition. He despised the idea that there could be any contract based on mutual interest between the individuals and the state. So, the language of contract is for serving certain purpose, and once that purpose is not served, the contract is immaterial. That cannot be the relationship between the individual and the state according to Hegel. So, he argued that the essence of modern state is its capacity to exact unconditional obedience, and why individuals should be willing to even sacrifice his own self for the protection of a state. There has to be certain ideal, there has to be certain goal which fulfillment of which they see their own realization. So, you are not free if your country is not free, or something similar to that, where the protection of your country is seen as an extension or also simultaneously the protection of your own self or your own freedom. So, there is a kind of unconditional obedience to that state from the citizen, and Hegel also discussed the role of state in wars and also as an actor in the world stage. And in contrast to the perpetual or the everlasting peace that we discussed in Kant and also to some extent in Rousseau, Hegel believed that wars is necessary for securing the national objective. So, state goes to war for certain objective, for the protection of its own national interest, and they do so in a very rational calculative manner. So, the perpetual peace would lead to a kind of stagnation, and Hegel wanted the state or the individual to realize the value of a state or his or her own life while there is the presence of other, that is the threat to the peace from the external forces or threat to the life while you may die in war or state may send you to war. So, there is this simultaneous presence of opposite that makes the life real, and it is similar with the case of a state when it declares war. Individual realize the value of peace and stability, and war is inevitable. So, state has a duty in a sense to prepare its citizen for the war, and it also goes to war. And he also argues that the modern states are actors in the world history where they could establish the universality of freedom. So, this idea of freedom is then not limited to one state or one group of people, but it has a universal appeal, and the state which is representative of the universal and absolute will has the duty to extend it to the other states, to the universe. And there he gives the example of classical Greek, Rome and other civilization as well. So, that is all in this lecture today. You can refer to these texts like Shlomo Avinari, Hegel's Theory of Modern State, Friedrich Besser, the Cambridge Companion to Hegel, David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to the Present, Will Durant you can again refer to, and Cephalizza, Western Political Thought from the Ancient Greeks to the Modern Times, James Allen Wren on Politics remain along with Cephalizza a reference text for this course. And you should also refer to Peter Singer, Hegel, a very short introduction, particularly to understand Hegelian conception of master and slave, and also Charles Taylor, Hegel, Cambridge University Press, 1977. So, these are some of the texts to understand more about Hegelian conception of civil society and state, and how the realms of human freedom or the location of human freedom. So, for that you should refer to these texts. Do share your views and comments. We will be happy to hear and respond. Thanks for listening. Thank you all.